Welcome to a special conversation with B'nai B'rith International, the latest in our expert analysis series. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. We appreciate your spending some time with us today. Today, we'll be talking about the shifting dynamics in the Middle East region, particularly focusing on Iran, the vital U.S.-Israel relationship, and what to expect going forward regarding U.S. policy in the Middle East. Joining me for today's discussion are two experts in their fields. Clifford May is the founder and president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a nonpartisan policy institute focusing on national security. Mr. May has had a long and distinguished career in international relations, communications, politics, and journalism. From 2016 to 18, Mr. May served as commissioner on the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent bipartisan U.S. federal government commission that makes policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress in order to advance religious freedom around the world. Omri Nahmias is the Jerusalem Post's Washington bureau chief, covering U.S.-Israel relations, Israel-related legislation in Congress, and the 2020 presidential election. In his role, Mr. Nahmias maintains relationships with senior White House officials, members of Congress, and Israeli diplomats. Before joining the Jerusalem Post last year, Mr. Nahmias was Walla News' Washington bureau chief, covering the 2016 presidential election. Cliff, welcome, and thank you for taking the time. And Omri, welcome back. It's great to have you with us again. We're excited to have you both here. Well, let's dive right in to the subject at hand. Cliff, a few weeks ago, the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency said in a report that Iran is not only continuing to build up its stockpile of low-enriched uranium, but it now holds roughly 12 times the amount permitted under the 2015 nuclear agreement. Now, we've known and were vindicated by Israeli agents back in 2018 who ferreted out these thousands and thousands of documents from Tehran about the Iranian nuclear program, that Iran has always had a military nuclear program. Now, with last week's killing of Iran's top nuclear scientist, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, a clear message to Iran was being sent. And yet, what followed was immediate condemnation by Europeans and even some here in the US. How do you explain that reaction and their failure to see the existential threat that the Iranian nuclear and missile programs pose to the region?
It's really astonishing, Dan. You have people, prominent people in media in the U.S. and Europe, for example, continuing to say, well, we don't really know if the Islamic Republic of Iran has a nuclear weapons program. You see in major newspapers, they say the Iran's rulers deny they have such a program. They make like they don't know. And then there are others who say, well, yeah, but the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran deal that was concluded under the Obama administration, that stopped them from getting a nuclear weapons, acquiring nuclear weapons, even though the Iranians don't admit they've ever had this program. There are people who don't believe it. Look, what the evidence is absolutely clear, undeniable, and incontrovertible if you'll only take the trouble to look at it. The Iranians have had, under this regime, and do have a nuclear weapons program. It is a militarized program. The International Atomic Energy Agency has made good attempts to monitor whether or not Iran, which claims to be still abiding under the JCPOA, along with our European friends, even though we're out of it, whether they are abiding by the rules and not committing violations. They have been and are committing violations continually. And people, the larger issue is this, that the Islamic Republic of Iran has declared war against Israel and America. That's what death to America means. This is what death to Israel means. And they fight it when they can. Some call it the war between the wars, but it's not quite that. The Islamic Republic of Iran is trying right now, every day, to establish fortifications, outposts, bases in Syria from which to attack Israel. They are supporting Hamas in Gaza, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And they've got Hezbollah, which is their proxy, and Hezbollah has something like 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel. What's particularly troubling right now is that the Islamic Republic of Iran has been attempting, with some success, to get precision-guided munitions, PGMs, into Lebanon. These would be able to thwart Iron Dome and hit very precisely against Israeli targets. So this is a war that is taking place right now. Israel occasionally wages it as well. They don't always acknowledge they do so, but we know they do so, hitting targets in Syria, hitting Iranian targets in Syria in some cases. And we have reason to believe hitting some targets in Iran as well. If the Islamic Republic of Iran doesn't want to be hit, the Islamic Republic of Iran could negotiate, could send diplomats, could say we have no aggressive intents against Israel, as opposed to writing on its missiles death to Israel. So I'll stop there, but there's a lot more one could say about it.
Yeah, and we'd like to I'd like to bring up the JCPOA a little bit later, but I think with regard to this particular question and how it relates to the Europeans, if you have a regime which now is 41 years, soon 42 years on, come February of next year, that daily calls for the annihilation of Israel. To have this very glib these statements which are constantly coming out of Europe when it comes to Iran, to kind of not to dismiss the fact that Iran is in the nuclear business, but to dismiss the existential threat, which is clearly there to Israel every day, continues to be more than frustrating. But we'll come back to JCPOA in a bit. Omri, the recently signed Abraham Accords mark a new and historic movement towards normalization between Israel and many of the Arab countries. The normalization certainly has the potential to affect the balance of power in the Middle East. So how do you see things progressing or not going forward in terms of the momentum toward rapprochement between Israel and the Arab world, particularly the Saudis? Because when we talk about, we heard during that period in September and for the next 6 weeks, we had the UAE and Bahrain, then the Sudanese joined, and the rest of it was, and there will be more to come. And we really were looking forward to that, and I think perhaps may have come close in a couple of cases. And now we'll have to see where that leads. But would you comment on that and what the prospects might be from an Israeli perspective?
So first of all, thank you so much, Dan, for having me. Happy to be here. I think that any administration would be interested in promoting these accords, and the Biden team indicated that they will want to build on the recent agreements of normalization that we've seen. However, I believe it's going to be a pretty complicated task. We remember that the Biden team also indicated they want to rejoin the JCPOA, and they will need to balance between their desire to rejoin the nuclear agreement in Iran and keep promoting normalization agreements with the Arab countries in the region. And we know that from many aspects, these agreements are indicating the cooperation between Israel and Arab states against Iran. So I don't know exactly how the Biden administration would be able to master everything and to balance between these two, but for sure they will try to promote it. And I think that there is a certain aspect, you mentioned Saudi Arabia. I think this is the biggest question, because we remember, and maybe Cliff could elaborate on that during the Obama years, the US and Saudi Arabia had a pretty strained relationship. So I don't know how exactly this negotiation is going to look like. We all seen the report in Wall Street Journal indicating that the Saudis are considering to normalize ties with Israel. Maybe they will want to wait until the new Biden administration. But from the other hand, we should all point out that Jared Kushner and his team also trying to keep working on this angle and trying now to ease the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which could pave the way to normalization with Israel. If that's going to happen before January 20, we don't know, but it definitely seems like the Jared Kushner team is still working on that.
If I can, Dan.
Go ahead. Sure.
There's an important point that I think has been generally neglected in the coverage of the Abraham Accords. It's a wonderful thing in and of itself, absolutely first time over a generation that Israelis and Arabs are making peace. And unlike the peace with Jordan and Egypt, this is not transactional. This is a real normalization. It's a very different kind of peace already than the peace that Israel has with Egypt and with Jordan. But there's something else to it, and that is, keep in mind that before there was a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, there was an Arab-Israeli conflict. That's what there was up to 1967, when Nasser decided that he and other Arab countries were going to wipe Israel off the map. They said this is about Arab supremacy. This is about the Arab war against Israel. That war, the Six-Day War, failed for the Arabs. And as a result, the Israelis took Gaza from Egypt, not from Palestinians. They took the West Bank, which is what the Jordanians named it. They took it from Jordan, again, not from a Palestinian entity. And only after that did you have the transition from an Arab-Israeli conflict to a Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which was a brilliant stroke of public relations, because now you transform Israel from the David against all these Arab countries surrounding it into the Goliath, big Israel against the Palestinians. Now, what happens with the Abraham Accords? Something remarkable, because, and this is what was not paid attention to, the Palestinian Authority immediately asked the 22-member Arab League, 22 countries, including the Palestinian Authority and the Arab League, to condemn the deal. And the Arab League declined to do so. Keep in mind, also going back to 1967, what happened then? You had the Arab League, after the 67 war, issuing the infamous 3 no's. No recognition, no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel. In a sense, the Arab League is saying, the war with Israel as it was is now over. None of this could have happened with the Bahrain and with the UAE without the Saudis giving their tacit blessing to that. We know that for sure, and further evidence because the Saudis are now allowing the Israelis to fly across Saudi territory. I've been to Saudi Arabia. I remember hearing Saudis talk to me about not only their Jewish friends, but their Israeli friends. I thought, I don't know if they're telling me the truth or they're just blowing smoke for my benefit. But I think they have absolutely come to the conclusion that the Israelis pose no threat to them. The Israelis are not putting missiles on their breakfast tables without a good reason. That the Iranian regime is an existential threat, not just to Israel, but to the Saudis, but to the UAE, but to Bahrain. And it's perhaps a more imminent threat. And they also worry about the U.S. sticking it out in the Middle East and protecting them, as the U.S. has done in the past. And they think, if we have this existential threat, who's the best ally? Who can't leave the region? Who has a military capability? Who is determined? There's only one such nation, and that's Israel. And so they are not keen about the idea of wiping Israel off the face of the earth. They're smarter than that. And we can go on this. They also know that the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have not been sincerely interested in making peace with Israel. And that's another discussion, but it may be part of our discussion today.
Well, it's going to be part of our discussion in just a moment, but I want to move down to a different part of the regional map for a second. And that relates, this question relates to Yemen, which is, I think, an issue. And when we talk about the region, we talk about the hotspots. We have a proxy war going on in a couple of places. And when we look at Yemen, I think that's probably one of the least followed, and least understood, perhaps, of the issues in the region. And for whatever reason, and there are reasons we can discuss this, the Iranian part of what's going on in Yemen is oftentimes overlooked. It's overlooked in the media. It's the Houthis and the Saudis. It's not the Houthis acting as the proxy for the Saudis. I mean, the Houthis, I think, just fired off rockets the other day when Bibi Netanyahu was said to have been in Saudi Arabia. So, Cliff, what do you see in terms of the Yemen component going forward? What's going to happen here in in Washington with that particular aspect of this regional picture?
Predictions are hard to make, but you're absolutely right. The Houthis, whatever they have been in the past, have become very much proxies and clients of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Saudis are on the other side. I don't think the Saudis have fought this war cleverly or with any skill. It's a terrible, terrible humanitarian situation in Yemen at this point. The problem is that there are a lot of people in Washington, mostly on the left side of the aisle, who blame the Saudis and not the Iranians for what's going on, and they just want to stop supporting the Saudis, and they don't seem to recognize the ramifications should the Houthis, as clients of Iran, be able to take power in Yemen. Keep in mind, we do know what Tehran, what Iran's rulers are attempting to do. They're attempting to establish themselves as the hegemon of the Middle East. They want Yemen, which is a very poor country, but it's very strategic. We can talk about why later, but it's on a strategic waterway. They're trying very hard and may succeed in becoming the dominant force next door in Iraq, a country that has a Shia plurality, although Arab. They are very much involved in Syria, where essentially Bashar al-Assad has become their client. Hezbollah, their proxy and their foreign legion, controls Lebanon, which is a deteriorating country nonetheless. And again, they have their hands in both Gaza and the West Bank. And if the U.S. gets entirely out of Afghanistan, they'll be there too. They are there in various ways. They have been supporting the Taliban there, for sure. They've been supporting al-Qaeda there. They've been supporting al-Qaeda inside Iran. We had an al-Qaeda, the number 2 man in al-Qaeda recently assassinated in Tehran, where he was living quite comfortably in an upscale neighborhood of town. So if you look at all this, one front in this larger war for the Middle East is Yemen. And I think it's important to try to educate people that this is a war it's a proxy war between the Saudis and the Iranians. And it should not be clear to us that we want the Saudis to lose and the Houthis and the Iranians to win.
Well, here's a question for both of you. Omri, we'll go with you first. With new leadership, we have to look at the Palestinian issue and the conventional wisdom for Oslo Accord signed in 1993. So let's say 27 years. The conventional wisdom has been that the road to Israeli-Palestinian peace must pass through Ramallah. We had speaking of the Saudis, we had the Saudi plan, we had the FAD plan. The idea was if you could do the deal with Palestinians, everything else would fall into place. And now we've seen with the Abraham Accords that is not the case. I mean, the UAE and Bahrain haven't abandoned the Palestinians. They're just saying, look, I mean, if you want to stay there in the station and watch this happen, we can't wait for you. We have other things to do, and we're going to go ahead and do it. So the question is, now that conventional wisdom has been disproved, what will, and so much has happened over the last 4 years, so much has happened over the last year. What will there be a new approach to the Israeli-Palestinian issue? What do you think? The Palestinians have chosen, they've chosen here for the last 4 years to simply, to kick the can down the road intentionally and to wait out this administration. But okay, now, the time is here where things have changed. What do you say?
So first of all, I think that the Biden administration is expected first and foremost to focus on, domestic priorities. We know that the vaccine is weeks or months away, so it's not going to take a full 2 or 3 years for the Biden administration, but they're still going to be focused on domestic priorities. And even when you look at the foreign policy, I don't think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is on the top of the Biden administration priorities. You have a lot of challenges with China. You have the trade wars still going on. You have their desire to re-enter the JCPOA. You have a lot of tensions with Russia that remain unsolved. So I truly don't believe that Biden will try to put forward a new peace plan or something of that sort. We know because he indicated during his campaign he will try to restore ties with the Palestinian Authority, maybe reestablish some of the diplomatic missions in Washington and Jerusalem that have been closed during the past few years, maybe try to, bring them to the table in the sense of reestablishing diplomatic relations. We know that the Palestinians pretty much boycotting the US since Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But other than these symbolic moves of maybe reopening the Palestinian diplomatic mission in Washington, I don't see the Biden administration engage in something so ambitious as trying to, solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the next 2 years or so. And we also, from this administration, we should remember only 9 months ago or 10 months ago that, 10 months ago, the Trump administration put forward his vision to the Middle East, which included a solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but we've seen the Palestinians unwilling to engage with this plan. So I don't see Biden engaging in, trying to solve the conflict in the near future, at least.
Cliff, you mentioned earlier, you referenced the Arab League. And the decision by the Arab League to pass on criticism of Israel really was a breakthrough, no question, a historical breakthrough. And I tell people, look, don't take it from me, take it from the new winds that are blowing in the region, that things are changing. So what do you see going forward for the Israeli-Palestinian issue, given all that's happened, as we say, in the last 4 years, and then inside that 4-year period?
Well, I think not much immediately for the following reason. The Palestinians have two rulers. In Gaza, it's Hamas. Now, Hamas is not going to sit down and negotiate with the Israelis. They're not going to make peace with the Israelis. They cannot ideologically, theologically, they can simply not do so. Why can they not? Because they believe that any land ever conquered by Muslim warriors becomes an endowment, a waqf of the Muslims, and must remain that. And they feel that they cannot give that up. They cannot accept Israel as a state ruled by a Jewish majority. So Hamas is not part of this equation, never was, isn't now. Then you have the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is on the face of it more moderate, more secular. The problem is that Mahmoud Abbas, he's going on 85 years old. His health is not great. I think it's very clear that he has made up his mind that he is not going to end his days on the White House lawn shaking hands with Bibi Netanyahu, with either Donald Trump or Joe Biden slapping him on the back. That's not how he wants to go out. He wants to be remembered as someone who was a fighter, a warrior in the resistance, that he was like Arafat. He was not going to be called an Arab Zionist anywhere. He wants, when he dies, for his portrait to hang next to that of Arafat's. He does not want his portrait used for target practice by more radical elements. So does Biden understand what I've just said? I don't know. It seems to me I would find it hard to believe that Jake Sullivan, who's going to be his national security advisor, or Tony Blinken, who's going to be, I think, his Secretary of State, I think they are smart. They're smart guys. I think they must get that. So the question for them should be, okay, when Abbas goes, and it could happen within the next 4 years, either he retires, he dies, whatever, who comes next? Now, we don't know the answer to that, because in all the years that Abbas has been the president of the Palestinian Authority, he has never taken the trouble to put together a clear path to succession. He has not set up the structures and bureaucracies of a state, which is what absolutely necessary if there's going to be a Palestinian state. And so you could have bloodshed after he dies. You could have all kinds of fighting. You could have theoretically somebody from the Palestinian legislature who is actually with Hamas right now could be there. You could have the UAE and the Saudis playing a hand in determining who becomes the next Palestinian Authority leader. You could have Biden administration saying covertly, we want to play a hand. It's very important to us who comes to power there. How do we do that? Can we do that effectively? Can we do that quietly? And I don't know the answers to those questions. I'm not sure Joe Biden knows the answers to those questions yet. But the only way you get to peace, I think, between the Israelis and the Palestinians in a realistic way is for Abbas's successor to say, okay, I can't do what Abbas and what Arafat wanted to do. And what they wanted to do, by the way, and this is a very important point that a lot of people don't get, people talk about the Palestinian cause, as if we all know what the Palestinian cause is. And the Palestinian cause up to now has been that a Palestinian state replaces the Jewish state. When people, including people like Rashida Tlaib, a member of Congress, tweet from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. What do they mean? Free like in Gaza? Free like in the West Bank? Freedom of the press, freedom of religion? No, they don't mean. What they mean is Judenfrei, to use the German word, Judenrein, free of Jews. We will cleanse these areas of Jews. That has been the true Palestinian cause, and in Arabic you can see it. If the Palestinian cause becomes what we have hoped it would be, which is a Palestinian state peacefully coexisting side by side with a Jewish state, that can happen very rapidly. Israelis, I think, Omri can correct me if I'm wrong, will make a lot of concessions for that to happen. But that has not been the Palestinian cause up to now. And I know that, the Saudis know that, the Emiratis know that, sophisticated people know that. Once the Palestinians decide, okay, we have to live side by side with a Jewish state, we don't like the idea, but what are you going to do? It's better than sacrifice another generation, then peace will come. But it's not going to come with Abbas. It's not going to come with Hamas. And by the way, if it comes with the Palestinian Authority, then you still have the problem of Hamas.
So, we just come through, actually, just yesterday, we've just come through the votes in the UN on a number of anti-Israel resolutions, including the continued funding of two committees, the Committee on the Inalienable Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People and the Division for Palestinian Rights, both of which are committed, they're funded to perpetuate only the Palestinian narrative inside the UN. And both of these resolutions and those two committees were funded and they were adopted. The numbers are narrowing and it's looking a little bit better for Israel in the last couple of years. Nevertheless, it's as if, the world hasn't changed, at least inside the UN. And for the Palestinians, it's zero sum. And the question is, with the train moving, the normalization train, whether or not, other countries follow soon on or not, that's beside the point. The point is that by sending a message that it's zero sum, it's my way or the highway, it should be evident to everybody that there's a problem there. I want to move again. Question for both of you. We'll go to Omri. I want to go back to Iran. A lot has been said about the fact, again, that so much has changed over the last 4 years. Let's talk about the JCPOA. The Europeans, it seems, now the Europeans writ large, that's a large swath of countries. But those countries in particular that were engaged in the negotiation of the JCPOA just have seemed to be eager ever since the Trump administration pulled itself out, eager to go back in. And there are all kinds of questions. We hear going forward that, yes, we have to do a new deal. It has to be better, has to be this, has to be that. But there may be a price to pay. It may be a price to pay just to get the Iranians back to the table. And in the last 4 years, again, I referenced the Israeli agents who were able to ferret out these documents. We know more about the Iranian program. You have Rafael Grassi, the head of the IAEA, who was saying, as I said at the opening of the program, look what's going on in Natanz with the centrifuges. So there are all of these things that are happening. We've got an Iranian missile program. Cliff, you referenced the precision-guided missiles. You've got all of the malign behavior, including, by the way, in Iran itself, the issues of human rights abuses, massive human rights abuses against women and juvenile offenders and LGBTQ, and it's really a full package, a full basket. So The question is, Omri, what's your take on the future of the JCPOA?
So Biden's officials, the Tony Blinken and others, said during the campaign that they would seek to strengthen and lengthen the original agreement. But we don't know exactly what they mean. When they speak about lengthening, I would expect them, to extend the sunset clauses that were included in the JCPOA and try to make it, instead of 10 years agreement, maybe 15 years or more, and trying to come to Israel and the Gulf states and say, look, we got them, to put their nuclear program on hold for a long period of time. But the question is, I think the main question is what strengthening means. Are they going to address the ballistic missiles program? Are they going to address the proxies? You haven't mentioned the proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah and other organizations. And what the European will agree to do together with the US to pressure Iran to agree for all these issues. I believe that Tony Blinken is completely there. He wouldn't, he would want to pressure the Iranians when it comes to the ballistic missiles program and when it comes to the proxies, but he will need to have a cooperation from the other powers that are sides to this original agreement. And that's a key component of whether the US could press the Iranians to concede anything. So it's going to be a long process. It's not going to take a month or two. If anyone expect, in March 2021, we will see the JCPOA 2.0 has been signed. I don't think it's going to be the case. And another component is that some of Biden's closest allies said that they want to see Iran comes back to compliance with the original terms of the deal. Now we know that Iran now is enriching uranium in higher rates. They are pretty much rushing to a bomb. So first they would expect to see the Iranians scaling back all their efforts, and only then they would negotiate. We don't know how it's going to look like and how it's going to play out. So we're going to see a diplomatic process that I think if the US would want to do anything different this time, they will have to do it in a close consultation with Israel and the Gulf states. They will have to take their fears and their objections into considerations. Whenever they're negotiating with Iran, they will need to listen to the partners in the region and try to take whatever these countries that together. Now, we should also point out, in 2015, when the original agreement was signed, we knew that there is some sort of cooperation between Israel and Arab states, but now it's public. Now there is normalization between these countries. Now they could coordinate together a united stance when it comes to specific details in this agreement. So I believe that the US would want to consult with Israel and the Gulf states if they want the JCPOA 2.0 to look different than the original agreement of 2015.
Yeah, Cliff, let me pick up on what Omri said at the end, which is I think is a very important point. That when, in earlier administrations, when we were talking about the North Korean nuclear program, the South Koreans and the Japanese were very much in the picture. Wasn't just a phone call. I mean, they were truly in the picture. Among the many flaws of the JCPOA negotiating process, or even the worldview on this negotiation, that was just not the case. I mean, you had Germany and France and the Brits. I mean, everybody sitting around the table except, in this case, Israel and the Saudis, or Gulf states, Saudis representing the Gulf states, for their voice. What do you see going forward? I mean, you think it's in the works to bring Israel and the Saudis or the Gulf states to the table here? How will that look?
I think it's going to be much more difficult for Biden to do what Obama did, which is essentially to say to Israel and I would call them the pragmatic Sunni Arab states, we know what we're doing. We, the British, the French, the Russians, will negotiate this agreement with Iran. You'll like whatever we do, and we really don't want to hear your criticisms. You're not going to be at the table. We're going to figure this out. Obama, keep in mind, Obama had what I think we can most generously call an experiment in mind. He thought, okay, I think if we give a lot of money to the Iranian regime, and we show them that through trade and good relations, they can have a lot more money, they will moderate, they will liberalize. That's what's going to happen, because they'll see how great it is that we can provide much better services and a standard of living for our people. And isn't that more important than supporting Hezbollah and rockets pointed at Israel? Isn't that more important? And by the way, he also said the Saudis have to get used to sharing the neighborhood. That was the word, with the Iranians, sharing the neighborhood, as if, yeah, you know, you guys, you kids, you need to learn to play nice. There's toys on the floor, share them. I think this was tremendously insulting to the Israelis, who thought, this is our lives you're talking about, and you should be, we may know at least as well as you do how we protect and defend this country from a second Holocaust, from those threatening that every single day. The Saudis thought, really, you think you know this region better than we do? The Saudis sort of kept mum in the UAE and hoped that the Israelis, hoped Netanyahu could do it. He took the point going to Congress. A lot of Democrats refused to listen to him. He insulted Obama by not deferring to him. I think it's going to be harder for Biden to say, you guys sit it out, we'll tell you what we come up with. That's going to be harder. And it's harder in particular because it's now going to be very clear that the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Israelis are all on the same page. And they're going to say to Biden, are we your friends or not? Because if we're your friends, we should be involved in this conversation, or not. Or do you want to go back to Iran? The other thing that is going to complicate the situation, by the way, is the Iranian regime. They're not saying, okay, everything's fine, let's get it all back. They're saying the Americans defied international law by withdrawing from this agreement. I would argue that's not at all true. Doesn't stop them from saying it, doesn't stop a lot of people from believing it. And the Americans have caused us great economic damage. In fact, it's economic terrorism they've inflicted upon us. Anybody involved with it, including, by the way, my organization, they've named it by name, and people at my organization by name for promoting and working on the sanctions issue. So you're all economic terrorists. You deserve not only to be sanctioned, but you deserve whatever you get, including retaliation from our security apparatus. In other words, they've literally threatened our lives, literally. And they're going to say, so if you want us to come back and negotiate with you on a return to the JCPOA, don't tell us we have to comply. Tell us how much money you're going to put on the table to begin to compensate us for the damage, the economic terrorism you have done to our nation. And they may hold out for that. They may say, until there's money on the table, until there's some suspension of sanctions and perhaps some compensation delivered, we're not talking to you. That's absolutely a possibility that we may have. And it may be very difficult for Biden to say, okay, do I give them a few $1 billion? Do I allow, very likely, by the way, this came out of someone at AEI the other day, which surprised me, that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, should be allowed to give $5 billion with US blessing. We have not given this blessing up to now to the Iranian regime. $5 billion to help them get through the COVID epidemic, all that sort of stuff. It's possible Biden will say, yeah, they have the right to that. Let's authorize the IMF to give them $5 billion. That will not be popular, certainly with Republicans, and I think there are a significant number of Democrats in Congress with whom that will not be a popular move, particularly in this economic situation. Keep in mind, Congress, on a bipartisan basis, did not approve the JCPOA.
Well, let's move, if we can, back to Congress. Omri, speaking specifically now about the special U.S.-Israel relationship, there are certain constants that remain as strong as ever between the two allies. For example, military and intelligence sharing, cooperation, many other things. There also remain many steadfast friends and defenders of Israel in Congress, as well as some who would prefer a cooler relationship, to put it lightly. As someone who covers the Hill, can you speak about where you see the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship?
Well, I think it's a very interesting period right now in the aftermath of the election. Democrats expected to see a blue wave on Congress, on Senate, and also on the presidential level. And while, obviously Biden was elected and on the presidential level, it was a success, it wasn't exactly the situation on the congressional level. We saw Republicans gaining seats in the House, although Democrats will maintain the majority. They're going to have a very slim majority. And I guess you point out to a small but vocal group on the Democratic party that, they're saying you should condition aid to Israel and all these sorts of suggestions. But now with such a narrow lead in the House, I really don't see them, having enough power to achieve anything of their objective. And even to the contrary, I see a very interesting debate going on in the Democratic Party these days, where many moderators are pointing out to the more radical voices and telling them, because of you, we lost seats in the House. Because of you, we weren't able to flip enough Senate seats and to gain majority, because of messages like defunding the police and socialism and all that. We all heard the Abigail Spengler recording where she said that when the party goes too much to the left, many people are not really listening to the message and they won't sign up to that kind of message. And I also think it's interesting to look at Biden and how he treats this group as a whole. I think they expected so far to have more of their people appointed to some kind of, I don't know if a cabinet level position, maybe other position, but so far Biden really stick with more moderate voices. So when you are looking at, who is promoting the agenda and which camp is going to prevail, it seems like as of now, the more moderate voices have more power within the party. Now, it doesn't mean that the battle between the two camps is over. It doesn't mean that, the more radical camp is not trying to be more vocal and trying to, get his base more energized, looking forward to 2022. But I don't expect them to change anything fundamental when it comes to the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Well, I think, you said it before, and it's, of course, we hear it all the time, and we talk about it ourselves, about priorities. I mean, the COVID crisis and the accompanying economic situation, together with, the first year of any new administration, is sort out all kinds of other things. You're going to have a confirmation process that goes forward for cabinet positions. Our friends and our allies and our rivals out there are going to be assessing exactly where we're going to be going. So it's possible that given all of that, these issues, which we're discussing right now, may, of necessity, be moved somewhat down the chain of priority, although one never knows. If someone has a bee in their bonnet about an issue, it can proliferate to the point where it goes back up the priority ladder. But there's a lot of things going on here, particularly this year, and we'll have to see where all of this shakes out. One more question, Cliff. This one, we're going to switch gears to the Eastern Mediterranean. Go back to Iran for a second. Iran is constantly looking to upgrade its navy. It's seeking a blue water naval presence, from what we understand. It's another example of extending hegemonic control or hegemonic interest in the region. Facing that, we have this tripartite alliance, or this alignment, I should say, amongst Israel, Greece, and Cyprus. as well as Egypt and Jordan, who have joined in some ways. For example, I think Greece and Cyprus each have their own arrangements with the Egyptians. And a lot of this has to do with energy, and a lot of it has to do with stability in the region. How do you read the Eastern Mediterranean going forward in terms of those very important geopolitical issues that we've talked about today? And there are other things that go into it too. There's trade, there's tourism, clearly in that region, very easy to get from one place to the other. But it's the geopolitics that really commands our interest. What do you say?
Yeah, we should be looking at the Eastern Mediterranean very carefully. It's sort of a tinderbox for a lot of reasons. Not Lebanon is involved in that. Hezbollah is involved in that, and Hezbollah again being a proxy for Iran, and a country we haven't mentioned, Turkey, which also under Erdogan has hegemonic ambitions for the region as well. In a way that also gets back to your earlier point, I think you're right that the Biden administration might like to think, we have so much to do domestically. Let's put all the foreign policy and national security issues on a back burner for a little while longer. We'll get to them as soon as we can. But that may not be possible, because what may happen is that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei in Tehran decides this is a good time to push and press and see what I can get away with the United States. And I'm going to test President Biden and see if he fails the test. You could have China absolutely doing that in all sorts of ways. The most dramatic would be to say, it's time, we took Hong Kong in an egregious violation of our treaty obligations. Let's go after Taiwan. I don't think President Biden's going to stop us. You could have Kim Jong-un in North Korea say, this is a good time for me to see how far I can go and see what Biden is made of. You could have Erdogan either becoming more friendly with the US or becoming less friendly with the US. He is the least reliable NATO ally, but he's also the second strongest military within NATO. So you've got explosive situations all through, and then you do have Lebanon, which at this point is just deteriorating at an unbelievable rate. It is so badly in debt. They will look not only to the IMF but to Biden and say, give us billions of dollars to get us out of this, because we're going to be in a terrible depression very soon. They almost are. But it's so hopeless. Will the US public say, yeah, let's give 5, 10, 15, 20 billion dollars to Lebanon with Hezbollah, essentially, for all intents and purposes, running the country? Would we want to do that? So I just think Biden may want to concentrate on building back better in the US, but I think he's going to be tested by one or more of these foreign despots, and sooner rather than later. That's as much of a prediction as I'm willing to make, but it is one I'll go that far on.
And Omri, just a word on the East Med. From the Israeli perspective, extremely important in terms of these new arrangements. What do you say?
You mean about if you could be more specific?
Well, the future of East Med going forward. I mean, what do you see as the particular issues relating to stability, given what's going on in Lebanon, in Syria, unrest in North Africa? We talked about Libya, but just in passing, and not to mention everything else. The importance of the Eastern Mediterranean to stability in the region.
Yeah, for sure. I think also we should also point out that Israel had a vote yesterday in the Knesset, although it was first reading, but still there was a first step towards a fourth round of election in 2 years. So I think we should also calculate the political stability in Israel into that. There is a good chance we will see another round of election around March or maybe May. But it sounds like the train has left the station and we're on track to go for another round of elections. So it's going to be really interesting to see, given the very specific agreement between Netanyahu and Gantz, that even when Israel is going to elections, the power sharing agreement is going to remain on place, meaning we might see a situation that Benny Gantz is still Minister of Defense and Gabi Ashkenazi is still Minister of Foreign Affairs and Netanyahu is Prime Minister, while Israel is heading for another round of elections. So that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, how it changed the dynamic in Israel and in the region as a whole.
Well, cliches are there because they're true. So let's say never a dull moment.
Yeah, that's for sure.
In the region, that is clear. Well, Cliff and Omri, we could talk for hours about these issues, particularly on the heels of the Abraham Accords and as the U.S. transitions to a new administration. But in our time together, we have learned a lot about events and policies in the Middle East and what to expect in the future. And we thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, I want to thank FDD founder and President Clifford May and Jerusalem Post Washington Bureau Chief Omri Nahmias for being with us today and sharing their insights on the rapidly changing Middle East landscape. And thank you for tuning in to this expert analysis conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.